and vinyl people. We're back up in the vinyl attic, and we're doing this 100 albums that should be in your collection, or I think are essentials to your collection, and we're at one that's kind of inevitable. We've done Paul McCartney album, we've done the George Harrison album, we've done the Ringo Starr album. We've got to do Beatle John, and I'm really excited about the album I'm talking about today because I think it's one that's finally kind of come back into the consciousness. We're talking about 1974's Walls and Bridges. This is the original. Look at this cool album cover. Oh, look at this. All kinds of surprises. There's John. Talking about this album that came out in 1974 as kind of the quintessential what if album. What if John had really had a solo career in a way that was similar to Paul's without taking detours into primal scream therapy and politics and the avant-garde, if he'd really sort of kind of focus on the music. This is a really interesting album. It comes out in September 1974, and it is sort of associated with John's Lost Weekend. He had been working solo-wise with Phil Spector. Some of the stuff was great. Some of it was not so great. And speaking of sometime in New York City, and then he put out Mind Games, which is an attempt to be a little bit more poppy, and that album kind of suffered. He produced it himself, but it suffered from just not great production. And some of that beautiful record, I mean, I just think of Mind Games being on the radio all the time when I was my daughter's age. Some of that has been fixed. 2 weeks ago, a new, updated, remixed, reconfigured deluxe set of Mind Games has come out. We're going to talk about that album coming up, but it really is a chance to rediscover Mind Games. But then he and Yoko split. John heads off to the left coast to LA, where he starts rediscovering his sort of bad boy Hamburg, Liverpool drinking self, and is engaged in a lot of debauchery. The most famous takes place at the Troubadour in West Hollywood, where he and Harry Nilsson are thrown out after harassing the Smothers Brothers. They would go and get drunk on Brandy Alexander's. I was at the Troubadour once. I was at the bar, and I said, in honor of John Lennon, I'm at the Troubadour. I need to have a Brandy Alexander. And the young bartender said, "What are you talking about?" And I told her the famous story of John Lennon being thrown out of the Troubadour. She had never heard it, and she also didn't know how to make a Brandy Alexander. And I just thought, kids these days. But I showed her how. So there's a lot of craziness, and John's hanging out with Ringo, he's hanging out with Keith Moon, he's hanging out with Alice Cooper, he's hanging out with these people that are just sort of tearing it up and not getting a lot done. He reunites with Phil Spector, and they want to do a record of rock and roll oldies, which apparently are insane. Everybody's drunk all the time. Phil Spector is shooting a gun in the studio. John is doing it because he's under a lawsuit after kind of ripping off a line from Chuck Berry on the song Come Together to record a couple more Chuck Berry songs. And so this is him trying to do some of these oldie songs to pay back. And it just falls apart, and Phil Spector disappears with the tapes. And John, in the meantime, is writing music. He's producing. He produces this kind of weird album with Harry Nilsson, Pussycats, which is an interesting document of that time. He records a song for Ringo called Goodnight Vienna. He produces a song for Mick Jagger called Too Many Cooks that's finally come out. And he even jams with Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney shows up, and he and John and Paul and Stevie Wonder, apparently all a little bit high, jam. The bootleg's been out forever. It's not, the only reason we're listening to it is it's Paul and John 10 years after Beatlemania. So they were warming up. And then finally he's like, I got to get my act together. I'm under contract. I got to put out another record. And he heads back to New York to do this thing that would become Walls and Bridges. Again, he's producing it himself. He's in the record plant, which is a little, a home space for him. He assembles the band of usual suspects: Klaus Voormann, his old friend from the Hamburg days, Beatle confidant on bass, Jesse Davis, who a lot of people know from George Harrison's work in Concert for Bangladesh, Jim Keltner, who plays drums on all these records. Jim Keltner is the official Beatles solo drummer, I think, still going strong, and starts recording this album that is sort of introspective. It's introspective in the sense that he is thinking about where he is in his life. He's thinking about being away from his woman, so there are a lot of songs like Bless You that are about Yoko and missing Yoko. He also has this new love, May Pang, so he has songs about her, Sweet Bird of Paradox, and he's looking back. You know, this is sort of a new era of nostalgia. So one of the things he did when he was in LA is show up on the set of Happy Days. And so he's kind of getting in touch with his own past and making this record that has a complete sound. There's no Yoko on it, like sometime in New York City. It's just him in the studio. And Jimmy Iovine, who engineered it, who has done so much stuff since this record, including a lot of Patti Smith records. I saw him last on American Idol as like a celebrity mentor. Jimmy Iovine said he was incredibly professional. They worked from 10 to 8 p.m. John came in with songs that he knew wanted to be done, and some of them were to become FM staples. So one of the great songs on here that I think is the most Beatle-y is Dream Number 9. That has this sort of ethereal dream. May Pang's voice floats in and out of it, and was a big hit, and it sounded like this is what should be on the radio right now. There was another song he was recording with Elton John. Elton John was around. Elton John was at the peak of his powers. Elton John was riding high on the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road album, showed up in the studio to work on a couple tracks, including a song that John had heard on a soul radio show, this line, Whatever Gets You Through the Night. So he does this up-tempo song, Whatever Gets You Through the Night. Elton is on piano and organ and backing vocals, and Elton says, this is a number one hit, and John was the only Beatle who hadn't had a number one hit. Paul, Ringo, and George all had number one hits, and John hadn't had a number one hit. Not even Imagine or Mind Games went to number one. And so Elton John says, if this goes to number one, you have to appear on stage with me. And John's like, that's not going to go to number one. I don't have number one hits anymore. And sure enough, Whatever Gets You Through the Night in 1974 goes to the top of the charts. And Thanksgiving at Madison Square Garden, Elton John is playing, says we've got a very special guest, and John Lennon comes out on stage to play the song, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and a song by his old friend Paul. I Saw Her Standing There, and supposedly backstage he and Yoko reunite, and that's the end of the Lost Weekend period. There's also these sort of songs about people that have creeped in his life that he's reevaluating. Steel and Glass is supposedly about Alan Klein, their business manager. Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out is this incredibly introspective song about being fragile and being lost. And so there's a lot of inner monologue on this record, and it's not something that we got a lot of in the 1970s. We get it now. I mean, I think the sort of Taylor Swift thing is like you're having a conversation with your inner self type stuff. But in 1974, this was kind of new. This was sort of, nobody was in therapy, but John was sort of in therapy on this record, and not dealing with, his mother, like on Plastic Ono Band, but dealing with his separation and the mistakes that he made. And it's interesting to think about it in those terms. I mean, if you think Plastic Ono Band in 1970 was his statement of the dream is over, or I'm done with the Beatles and this is me now, Walls and Bridges is his sort of statement that John and Yoko is no longer a thing. It would become a thing again, but they're no longer a thing, and this is who I am as a complete person. And it's a real picture of what he could have done in the 70s, in a time when, the radio was full of songs by Steely Dan and sort of more progressive FM-geared music. John all of a sudden was in that space. And I love the album package when it comes out. The you've got these great drawings from him when he was a kid, these silly pictures, the inner sleeve, more Silly John, and then it comes with this great little lyrics book with more pictures from his childhood. So he's really connecting, which makes sense because on this record was also the time when he was reconnecting with his son Julian, who actually pops up on the last track in a little goof around in the studio called Ya Ya, which is another attempt to redo an oldie. A lot of these tracks were sort of workshopped for a while, and some of them came out in the 80s on this album, Men Love Avenue, which has never been released streaming, as far as I know. This is my copy from Turtles Records. This record sort of helps fill the gap because once Walls and Bridges comes out, the record company sort of recaptures the Phil Spector tapes and puts them together, and John does some more work on them and puts them out as rock and roll in 1975. One of the fun things about this record is that John is in a conversation with Paul throughout his solo career. He's totally blown away by the success of Band on the Run, which comes out in late 1973 and dominates all the airwaves in 1974. When he's in LA at Capitol Records, he hires the guy that promoted Band on the Run to promote Walls and Bridges. There's a track on here called Beef Jerky, which is a weird response to Paul's Let Me Roll It, the guitar riff on Let Me Roll It, which was Paul's response to John's guitar riff on Cold Turkey. So you kind of see them going back and forth, and you get a sense that even though there's been all this friction in the first half of the 70s, they're starting to sort of move back together, including hanging out together in LA and jamming. There is also talk of a follow-up to this record. Supposedly, John had an album planned for 1975. John was a big fan of R&B music on the radio, and according to this really great book, which is one of my many Beatle books, Lennon and McCartney Alone Together, he was planning on making a record with Carlos Alomar, who he'd worked with on David Bowie's Fame record, and he apparently asked Carlos Alomar to assemble a bunch of African-American musicians to record a funk, soul, disco album, for whatever we'd call it in 1975, called Between the Lines. A disco album from John Lennon. I wrap your mind around mid-70s. This is like before disco got super cheesy, so we're talking about, play that funky music, white boy, kind of mid-70s disco sound before it was really, really gross. Imagine having a John Lennon funk album with Carlos Alomar from Bowie's band. I just can't imagine what that record would have been like. What ended up happening, of course, is when he got back together with Yoko, she got pregnant with Sean, who was born on John's birthday in 1975, and he decided to quit the music business for a while. They had rock and roll music out, then they put out the Shaved Fish compilation, and he was done with his contract to Apple. The Beatles were officially dissolved as an entity in 1976, and he was just going to sit at home and bake bread for the next 4 years until he starts working on Double Fantasy in 1980. So the Beatle dream was sort of, in another phase at that point until that day in 1980. It's a really great John Lennon album that has so much insight into how we think, how we're doing. How am I doing? How am I doing, John? This is kind of the theme of this record. How am I doing at this moment? What do I need to make it through the day? Am I on this lonely dirt road? He has a great song with Harry Nilsson called Old Dirt Road. Is it a dream state that I'm in? It's all very reflective and a picture of what could have come from John if he'd been a late 70s album artist, which he wasn't, but he was happy as a dad, and that's a cool thing. Stay-at-home dad. There's the guy that started it all. All right, I love this album so much. I always go back to it. I always discover new things, and the little insight that we get from where John was in mid-70s after his lost weekend, after his 18th month separation. The lost weekend. It was a long time. Okay, I want to share that with you. I love this record. There'll be more Beatle talk later. We're not done with the Fabs, but I wanted to make sure that we knocked out in our first 51 of each of the guys. Next time, we're going to talk about a friend of John's, somebody that he both interacted with and was a rival with, and had lots of things to say, and sometimes made fun of, Mr. Bob Dylan. We're finally going to get to Dylan. We're going to talk about the Dylan record you love to hate. The Dylan album you love to hate. The Bob Dylan album that is the most hated Bob Dylan album ever. I think, anyway. Self-Portrait. We're going to talk about Dylan's Self-Portrait and why that should be in your collection. I know, we're not choosing the most likely ones. We're choosing the weird ones, because that's how we do it here on Vinyl Fetish. All right, you know John Lennon matters. He's still with us. He's still in. They sang Imagine at the opening ceremonies of the Paris Olympics. Tears going down. John is always with us. I Want to Hold Your Hand is in some commercial now. I mean, John will never leave us. John Lennon matters so much, so much to me in my life. John, this album matters. Of course, this music matters. You matter. Let's talk about it.